And today's panel is focusing on disruptive technologies. And that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So just kind of starting with the basics. And Clark, you get to see a lot of this from where you sit within Austin Ventures. But what would be your definition of a disruptive technology?
So in the energy field, I think a disruptive technology is one that's able to kind of cross over this gulf of scalability to kind of get to the scale that's pertinent on the energy side of things, which is very large scale.
Okay. Craig, and you're out there, working in the industry, trying to start up a company. Do you feel like your company's technology is disruptive, and why?
Well, yeah, I think that everyone's kind of recognized, it was on the panel yesterday, everyone started talking about energy storage. And sort of fortunately or unfortunately, everyone gets tied into thinking that lithium is storage and storage is lithium. They're kind of like the Kleenex of this day. And what you're starting to see is that there are certain energy technologies that work well for certain applications. And we specifically went after grid scale storage, and what our case is we started focusing on the microgrid application. And what we end up doing is enabling all the other pieces to work. So solar's been a standard technology that's well known and understood as wind, but when you start trying to team that up into providing power for remote power applications and displacing diesel, really battery is that mechanism that is the enabling technology that makes all of it work. So that's why it's disruptive.
Okay. And, Tom, one of the things we always like to hear about is the vision for the future. And, you've been in this game, potentially longer than anybody else. I'm not going to make any age jokes. But anyway, you've seen a lot of things over the years. And, again, had some pretty compelling thoughts on the phone about the future and the things that need to occur for this industry to change, to innovate, to morph, to become potentially disruptive. So could you share sort of your vision of the future with the group?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with integrating different things. And this is a technology conference. We tend to be really focused on technology, but as a technology guy myself, I can tell you a lot of times the technology is the easy part. The hard part is the way the market is structured, and the legal and the regulatory. I think I use the example of Walt Disney, who just clean sheeted it when he went out and did Walt Disney World. And I think that's kind of what we need to do. In the area of energy storage, we talked a lot about that. There was a lot of talk about that yesterday. But we need to broaden our thought about what is energy storage. It's not just a battery or batteries. The example that we use is there's a technology, generation storage, where you store electricity as cold water. You take off-grid power, you store it as chill water, and you recreate the megawatts by using the chill water to make a lot more power at the power plant, at the gas turbine power plant. And the advantage of this is you can use a megawatt hour of wind power at night and make 8 megawatt hours of on-peak power during the day. But people don't know about this. And it's not rocket science, but this is an example of what I'm talking about. We don't need some nuclear fusion or something way out there. A lot of times the answers are just combining different technologies in a unique way. And this is where I think the future is.
Okay. Well, that's the future, so let's take a little bit of a step back in the past. What I didn't mention in the bios were that Clark and Paul were together, as Clark termed it, in the Stone Age, working for AMD in Austin in the early 80s?
Mid-80s.
Mid-80s, okay, mid-80s. And so, these two guys got to see a lot of the evolution of the computer industry, the chip industry, back when America was in its heyday and was going to rule the world, and kind of things maybe didn't turn out quite that way in the computer industry. So Paul, can you think of, as we start embarking on this mission to change the energy industry. Can you think of any lessons learned back from the computer industry? Because we always like to compare telecom and cable and computer to energy, and it's kind of okay, but it really doesn't work. Anyway, so any lessons learned or analogies you can make from the things you saw, and Clark, I'm gonna get to you right after on this one.
That's a good question. There are certainly a lot of people who talk about the disruption of the utilities, electrical utilities, and have analogies to AT&T in the telecom sector. AT&T, of course, got disrupted by some judgments that came from the federal court system, and ironically, they're a more successful and more profitable and higher market cap company today than when they had a monopoly. So the question is, are the utilities going to be able to go through something similar, from my perspective? Who are going to survive in the deregulated world? And as we move into even less regulations, I think you're going to find some independent power producers that are very innovative, who are going to be adopting new technology, while you're going to find more traditional regulated utilities that may be fighting the wave. And it's too early to say how that's all going to work out, but certainly you're seeing some of those trends in those areas. And where I see that the most is in areas such as distributed generation, both distributed solar and distributed storage, which is an area that my company is particularly focused on at the moment. And so, for example, you look at one of the, I think, sort of flagship utilities in terms of setting standards in this area is Southern California Edison today. And we see that there was just a big announcement with, for example, Solar City last week, that they're sort of backing off from the idea of putting distributed energy storage out there. And the reason is, from my perspective, is that the utilities are saying if you're going to put storage in those locations, you're going to give up your net metering rights. And I think we have to, as an industry, start looking at the end of the net metering subsidy to solar. And part of that will be driving more towards self-generation, the word they use in Germany for basically integrating storage. So it'll be interesting to see how utilities adopt to these new trends, and it'll be an interesting game to watch.
Okay. Clark, any additional thoughts on that evolution?
I hadn't really thought about it, but there's a pretty strong parallel, I think, in that period right after Paul and I were working together, when the Japanese were kind of taking over the world in DRAM and everything else in electronics, largely on the back of industrial policy. And in the ensuing period, you saw two things happen in the semiconductor world. One is wafer fabs went wherever the government was willing to put up the money for them. And they went away from places where they might otherwise make sense. And in the long run, those policies, they were effective in the short term in moving industry into particular areas. And so you see that now with solar in China. There are a few US-based solar upstream manufacturers that are being successful. That's because they're vertically integrated all the way down to development of projects. But the lion's share of the successful companies, let's say 2 years ago, were Chinese, and that was because there was an industrial policy around build out of solar in China as well as build out of solar capacity. Now on the back end of that, you see what happened in DRAM, which is when there's oversupply that inevitably results from that, the low-cost producer ends up mopping up, and a bunch of other people go out of business. And so in the DRAM world today, you've got Samsung far and away the number one, Micron's in there, and I forget who's third, but the list drops off precipitously from there. And I think you'll see that in solar and other things that get to very large manufacturing scale. So inevitably, probably the same will happen with batteries in terms of the fundamental battery technology, but we're much further away from picking a winner there. First, somebody's got to go, put a lot of emphasis behind batteries. You see a little bit with the Chinese doing that now with the purchase of A123, but on a much, much lower, smaller scale than what was being done in solar 5 years ago.
Okay. And I think you're absolutely spot on that. And everything kind of tends to that over time. It's just a matter of what's the timing. And you talked about policy a little bit. John, you've had a lot of experience working in the Capitol with various very diverse interest groups around this whole clean tech energy space. What would you say is working, and potentially what's not working, and what potentially needs to change?
Yeah, so my experience was more on the private sector, and it was more with the utilities. So it was interesting to then move into the clean tech sector. I think what I'm really excited about, we've just had in Texas the first ever solar plant come out. First Solar doing their first market-based plant. It's not, they're doing it without a PPA. And they're very confident about what they're going to be able to do with that. So I think that, for me, it's exciting to see that within the current market structure, a company is coming in and they're confident that they can bid into that competitive market. With regard to specifics on the regulatory and the policy, I don't know that in Texas we're going to see any real support for, political support for policies that are going to, artificially boost solar in the Texas market and in the deregulated markets especially. But what I am really optimistic about is the fact that First Solar is doing this project, and there's a number of other ones in the pipeline that are following.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I'm going to throw this one open to the group. Just if anybody, take the question, but do you believe these technologies that are coming can be disruptive in a pure merchant power market-based environment? Or do we need some type of policy intervention, potentially subsidies, to get the ball rolling? Tom?
I'll take that. I don't know that we necessarily need subsidies, but what we do need is the right metrics that can be financed.
Correct.
Like Texas doesn't have a capacity market, okay? So what is the right pricing signal to ensure that we have enough capacity? Because obviously that's a lagging indicator. If you wait until prices really spike up, and they have to spike up long enough that the bankers are comfortable that you can finance new generation, right? So that's a lagging indicator. So same with ancillary services. I'm still, as we talked on the phone, as an innovator, my biggest challenge is really understanding the market, the financial market. It's very complicated.
And that market's starting to get defined. For energy storage, though, I call it the crisis reform policy, because Hurricane Sandy comes and there's going to be a premium that companies like LIPA or Long Island Power Authority are going to put on storage they wouldn't even considered before. And the same thing happened with Fukushima in Japan. They're putting in extremely expensive storage into Japan and also China to handle their growth. So it's not always a straight cost and benefit justification. Certain policies will be driven by, catastrophe or whatever the case might be. So there are opportunities to jump into that market. But to your extent and to your point, there's got to be some ability for people to be able to derive what is the financial ability to put bank loan or bank lending behind it. And right now that just isn't really in place unless there's a capacity payment that we can ride on, and that doesn't work here.
Right.
I think it really depends on the type of technology, and different technologies are developing in different places. For example, Austin Energy just signed a very attractive wind deal. They just signed a very attractive solar deal on a dollars per kilowatt hour basis. And the things that drove those, there were policy things that drove them. They weren't necessarily even in the United States, right? The reason solar is so cheap right now is because Germany built a bunch of solar, and then Spain built a bunch of solar, and then the Chinese said, wow, we got to get in this game in a big way. It wasn't so much the U.S. framework at all now in the U.S. framework matters. It's not like it doesn't matter, but you've gotten that technology to a point where it is in many places at cost parity, and it has attractive attributes. In other cases, you do have these impediments. I think storage is one of the most notable ones where, because it's not entirely fish or fowl or, loaf of bread, you've got to figure out how are you going to get paid for a little bit of fish and a little bit of fowl and a little bit of loaf of bread. But, these, and some things are happening, particularly, I think, in the internet world and in the realm of finance with companies like SolarCity, where the disruption is sort of working against the grain of the incumbent structure. And so as long as the incumbent structure doesn't change, these disruptors are going to disrupt.
Okay, I want to come back to that point in just a minute, but first, Paul, you were able to get some money out of Wall Street a few months ago, right? On the IPO.
Yeah, we had a very successful IPO. In our S1, we originally had a goal of raising $12.5 million. We ended up raising $17.25 million. And a large percentage of that was based upon, I spent a lot of time talking to people, again, about energy storage and what we're doing in energy storage. So Clark sort of nailed it, and we've also talked about it, pretty much all the other panelists, is that most energy storage has a lot of value streams. Those value streams are highly dependent on location, and most of them are not financeable. And we've really targeted what we think is sort of the sweet spot of that market, or one of the sweet spots. Another one is the microgrid opportunity off-grid. But for the grid-tied opportunities, we think the big sweet spot is putting batteries, large-scale batteries in commercial buildings, and using that as basically an efficiency play, just reducing the electrical bill to the commercial customer. And by doing that, by reducing demand charges. And we think that is a very financeable business opportunity. Our customers, who are the energy systems integrators, they see that these things pay back in about 3 years today in California. We think they're going to be very attractive in New York, and I think in a year they're going to find them here in a big way in Texas. And again, those are things that can be bank financed. And we're seeing that a lot of these customers are rapidly going to move to a no money down policy, so commercial customers aren't going to have to pay anything to get these things installed, because they save enough money to pay for the financing. So getting back to your question about the business model and the technology model, you can have disruptive technology, but you got to be able to use that to disrupt a large established market. And certainly Wall Street was convinced that we had the ability to do that, and that was really how we were successfully able to finance a very small company based here in Texas with really not only not profitable, but almost no revenue of any significance. But we have a technology and we have a business model which we think will be very impactful on the industry.
Okay. Well, on the technology disruption piece, if you go back in history and look at, let's take the last 2 or 3 large market deregulations, which would be, look at the airlines, and then let's look at telecom and cable. In both instances, with the airlines, you had the invention of the jet engine, okay, and then for telecom, while there was still copper wire, the advent of wireless communications and an alternative path into the house is what really tipped it over and put that market disruption and really that deregulation into overdrive. Now, looking at it from my perspective, I don't see the jet engine or wireless communications in the energy industry right now.
It's
John,
interesting.
you want to disagree?
Well, I think, I would actually agree with you, but I don't know that that's where the disruption is gonna happen. I think, if we've got the technology we need, I think to our earlier point, it's about the integration, it's about the systems optimization and how we integrate the current technologies, right? To go back to what Steve Wozniak was talking about yesterday, I don't think it's about the invention. It's about the incremental gains that we can make, right? And I think that comes through using the current technologies, integrating them into systems that work for the consumers. And I think to Paul's point, the models where it's zero up front, and it makes it really easy for consumers to adopt this, to adopt the technologies and systems, is where a lot of that disruption is going to occur. you know, if we had a Manhattan project or a NASA for energy, I don't know that it would necessarily be to find the newest, the next best technology, but how to maybe improve on what we have and then integrate what we have into the best systems. Right?
You know, I'm going to disagree with that a little bit, and that is that the things that we're doing in the flow battery space absolutely could not have happened 10 years ago. The improvements in fluid dynamics and stuff that we've learned from the semiconductor industry, the way that we manage our active balance between the cells we stole from the automobile industry and how they do it at Tesla. The apex of things that have come together. Now, they're incremental improvements in their respective space, but we've been able to look at packaging and leveraging all of this knowledge that has been learned in adjacent industries. And really, what we've been able to do in 4 years couldn't have been done 10 years ago. And it's all been because of the developments that's happening in other areas. It's different packaging, it's different positioning, and it's different economic models. You know, the battery that we designed had nothing to do with anything more than providing energy capacity. And I knew that we didn't get paid for capacity, so we had to change the battery. So those things are happening. The cool things aren't coming out of GE, Siemens, and the usual cast of characters. The cool things are coming from the small, innovative companies. And unfortunately, some of them don't see the light of day because of lack of funding, and some of them don't see the light of day because they don't pull together the right team to execute. But there are some extremely cool things happening out there, and I think you'll be wildly surprised at what's around the corner.
I want to weigh in with what John said, and I think the key thing you said was deregulation. To me, that's what this industry needs. Even more than technology, it needs deregulation. And by that, I mean, again, I'll go back to the Disney example. I mean, if I were a green developer and I was building a brand new city, I would do it completely different than any city on the planet. And the way I would do it, and this is where the disruption is the integration. So I'll give you an example. We've talked a lot about microgrids, okay? But rather than just provide your own distributed power, you would also do your own heating and your own cooling. So tri-generation from the same energy source, because that's how you get your efficiency up. You can put all of these utilities in the same trench, but I wouldn't stop there. I would also add water and wastewater. Okay, now you tell me, what developer is integrating those 5 utilities? I've not seen one anywhere in the world. This is where the disruption is going to come from, in my opinion. But the problem is, you've got a whole wastewater industry. Even water and wastewater don't talk. Definitely power and the heating and cooling people don't talk. And everybody's got their little fiefdom. But if I was the king, I would say, okay, we're going to set a metric and we're going to measure everything. Emissions, cost, performance, and we want to optimize the entire system to come up with the lowest cost. And to Steve Wozniak's point, cost in a way is related to pollution if you do a life cycle. We don't do life cycle metrics either. We should do that. We got to get our metrics right.
I think that one big change that is happening, but it's happening gradually, is you're going away from the model of there are generators and there are loads and there are wires, and you're going to things that are software controlled, where there's innovations in finance. You know, there's a very interesting deal announced yesterday, I think, where Solar City is with a venture capital firm backing this company that's tying mobile payments to solar generation in Africa and basically allowing people to buy solar, you know, by the kilowatt hour in even smaller increments than that for specific purposes using mobile payments. And you know, that's the kind of thing that in the old model you just can't even imagine it, right? It's a totally different thought paradigm.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that a bit too. I think there is disruption coming. I think we're in this classic adoption curve and we're in the early adopter stage, and the question is when do we reach that inflection point where we get into the early mainstream? And I think, for example, if you look at electric vehicles, we're maybe still just a couple of years away from that, but we're getting close and people can sort of feel that. And I think some of these other areas are that way as well, and particularly the we talked about these remote grids in developing parts of the world. There's still 1 billion plus people on the planet that don't have access to a general electricity network. There is a huge value driver there in figuring out how to deliver that technology to them. And they say they can't afford it. That's not correct. Those individuals and communities have adopted cellular technology very aggressively. And I think that's one of those areas that you're going to see a huge disruption effect. And I think we're pretty close to being able to put the pieces together. As we talked about this financing option, there's a lot going on there.
Craig?
Yes.
You want to jump in?
You know, well, what I'm going to say is the collaboration and communications, all these pieces coming together. You know, a battery is a dumb reservoir of energy, and it needs smarts from a power control system. It needs smarts from an application software that communicates with the grid or the independent appliances. So our goal has been really to start making our alliances with the right type of people that we think have the technology. Because it's not enough to say there is interoperability. I mean, it's great to say I've got a standard platform and everyone's going to be wildly successful. The reality is, at this point, we have to get deeply threaded with our partners in the business. So from the inverter companies and the application software, you know, even almost you start talking about to the suppliers of the raw generation side of it. So it's not that difficult, I think, to overcome, but we're starting to see that momentum push, and it's getting a hell of a lot easier than it was 2 years ago. So.
Okay. I'm going to beat this dead horse just a little bit more. You know, if you go back and look at telecom and look at a lot of the VC investment around telecom prior to, if I get my dates right, maybe 92, prior to kind of the telecom industry taking off, where you had, you know, Cisco's evolution, and look at the amount of VC investment over the 4 years prior to that. Let's fast forward and look at a period from like 2000, 2004. Inflation-adjusted VC investing in energy is almost 3 times what the investment in telecom technology was, okay? And it usually takes about 7 years from when you start investing until you start seeing products and services. Now, my question is, if we started putting the money in 2000, we had 4 years, so let's start the clock ticking at 4 years, we should start seeing a lot of these technologies come to fruition around 2010, 2011. Well, we're in 2014, and we have literally spent billions of dollars in technology and investment, and we're not necessarily seeing the products and services in the marketplace that you would expect if you look at other industries. Why? Why is it not happening here?
There's been fantastic failures.
I think part of it is it's been a very odd number of years that this kind of energy emphasis was played out over. And you know, a lot of people start that timeline with the liquidity crisis, but it really starts with the liquidity bubble that preceded the liquidity crisis. Running up to the liquidity crisis, the conventional wisdom in clean tech was capital intensive is good. There's free money available in the form of debt with virtually no covenants and on a massive scale. And so the right way to run a venture play is to find something that will tap into that and, you know, use your little bit of venture capital to spin this gigantic flywheel or this gigantic gear of free, almost free debt. When the liquidity crisis hit, everybody woke up from that and realized, oh, capital intensity is bad, just like we thought it was. Oh, but the government came in with the stimulus program, right? Because they had to, right? We could have a philosophical debate about whether they had to or not, but the fact of the matter is, banks weren't lending to banks overnight. You know, there was a really extreme set of financial circumstances there, and so you had the government step in with stimulus, and so capital intensity wasn't necessarily good, but the government was there to kind of patch that for you. Well, that of course ran its course as it had to, and now you're back to the norms of venture investing, which are capital intensity is not good. Having a lot of government involvement in your venture capital-backed deal is not a good thing, and you know, all trees don't grow to the sky, and so it's much more rational But a lot of bad ideas died on the vine, and a lot of good ideas died on the vine in that, that vintage of clean tech and energy investments. I think enough good things happen that now you'll see derivative things, right? You do see successes. You see Tesla, Solar City, O-Power's on file. There's going to be a number of successes that come out of that. And people kind of forget, okay, there's First Solar's a pretty big company, right? SunPower's a pretty big company. Nobody's paying attention to those companies anymore, but they're actually doing pretty well.
Correct.
Okay. Any other?
I'm going to say God bless, because that's what I was going to say, that everyone recognizes the catastrophic failures of Solyndra and A123 obviously had their issues, and there's been a lot of carnage on the side of the road, but pets.com and a bunch of the websites that didn't make it during the .com bubble all failed, and everyone wringed their hands a little bit here and there. It is a capital intensive business, and it's been hard to raise money out of Sand Hill Road. It's been a little bit easier when we start having strategic discussions with companies like Eaton out of Milwaukee, or people that understand that capital intensive side of the business. For our purposes, I've been asset light. I've only raised $20 million to date, and it's all been through high net worth individuals. I've stayed away out of the VC community, which gives me a hell of a lot of flexibility, but it also creates a different set of issues when we go into our strategic funding round. So that's why I've got to look to those partners that understand the level of capitalization it's going to require to get towards a large scale deployments.
Okay, now it gets to be fun time. I get to make everybody king for a day. And we're going to start with Paul and work our way around. But you are king for a day. And in that day, you get to decide things. And we're going to restrict this to the North American market for now. But Paul, what would your headline read while you were king for a day if you could make one change or one contribution or invent one thing to help move this industry forward? What would that headline say?
You always give me the hard questions first. So
It's kind of like sitting in the front row next to the teacher.
yeah, I don't give a lot of thought to that question. Certainly, I think there needs to be more innovation on the regulatory side and the business model side. People like FERC are trying to do what they can. The DOE is trying to do what they can, but there's a lot of entrenched interests, and that will take a long time to work its way through the system. I'm not sure that you can do it any other way, though. I think that's inherently a part of the human nature in the business cycle. I think we have had some big successes, as we talked about. I think the cost, a good example is just what we talked about earlier, these big deals that Austin Energy's done. We've really reached grid parity with solar and wind and all these things. So it's not a matter of if those things are going to happen. It's really now, how do we expand? How do we integrate more of these renewables onto the grid? How do we look at more of those issues?
So maybe the headline is renewables now cheaper than coal. That could be a little scary.
It is. And,
It's getting close to being
and they're going to
true.
be shutting down a lot of coal plants in the next 20 years. And so we're going to need to backfill that. And the other issue is they're also going to be shutting down a lot of nuclear plants. We're already seeing this with songs in California and Indian Point, New York State. So we're going to need an infrastructure which is much more flexible and doesn't just look at base load and peakers. Mm-hmm. That whole analogy of the way that structure has been set up made a lot of sense 20 years ago. It's not going to make any sense 20 years from now.
Okay. Craig?
I guess total self-serving would be that FERC decides to regulate storage as transmission so I can get it into the rate base and we know who pays for it. The biggest problem for storage is, same issue we've talked about, is who pays for the product. And storage is going to continue to face that problem as they determine if it's generation, distribution, or transmission side of it. So it's that would be my wish list.
Okay. Tom?
Mine would be, as first order of day as king, would be to fire all the lawyers.
God bless.
No, seriously, I would really focus on getting the metrics right. I think if we simply did that, and I would start at a high level. By that, let's just take energy efficiency as an example. I would set a metric. What is your kilowatts per square foot for a building? Something that simple. And then you could subdivide it. What's the HVAC, what's the lighting, and what's the plug loads? And I would measure it. And I would make that part of, if you want to be a green building, you have to measure this stuff. You need to, if you can't benchmark, there's no way to get efficient. So to me, and I've gone around the world trying to focus on efficiency and district energy systems and all that. The biggest problem is people have no idea where they are. If I were to ask you, what is the kW per square foot of this building? What's the kW per ton of the HVAC coming out of that diffuser right there? Nobody has any idea. Why don't we at least set the benchmarks? And, you know, one thing that the EPA did right was a mile per gallon for a car. You can look at a car, this car and that car, and it's got a little number, and you don't need to know the gallons per horsepower hour at 60 horsepower. You've got a single metric. And if we just did that, I think we could solve a lot of problems.
Okay, so miles per gallon for energy created.
Correct.
I actually like that a lot. John?
So and I like what Tom said. I think measurement is key. You know, we've got to be able to measure it if we want to manage it and then increase those efficiencies. I think what I would love to see is more focus on that systems integration and kind of a move away from, if we're going to do the centralized model, then we got to have the water guys talking with the wastewater guys, talking with the cooling and the heating and the power generation, and then being able to make those measurements and benchmark and say, okay, we're not going to pick what technology you use, but you can't use X amount of water, or you only have X amount of water to use. You've got to have X amount of reserves available at any given time. And then, you know, again, to piggyback on time, get the lawyers out of the room and let businesses innovate. You know, I think that they're going to come in and they will fill the void. They will innovate. But if we hold them up in the permitting processes, if we hold them up in regulatory processes, it makes it that much more difficult. So I think focus on measurement and then focus on systems integration, and I would hope that would move us more towards a distributed system, a more distributed system.
A performance-based model. Basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, pay for performance.
Okay, so King John integrates the world, or integrates and measures the world. Okay. Clark?
So let me have two caveats. First caveat is the role of a venture capitalist is to give money to the person who's going to become king through their entrepreneurial efforts, not to be the king. And you know, the second thing I would say is the other role of venture capitalists is to make money for his investors, not really to, you know, solve the world's problems. With the few exceptions of firms that say I'm going to solve the world's problems while doing that. You know, so let me go a little bit utopian then and say, what one thing would make my life easier that's sort of a wish list item as opposed to a policy change. I would like to see the debate around all of the things with regard to energy be more rational and more based on facts and reality and models that are tested, as opposed to it's very political right now. There's literally almost no article that you read that does not get written from an angle and financed by somebody who is pushing that angle. And that's whether it's pro-renewables or anti-renewables, pro-wind, pro-solar, anti-wind, anti-solar, pro-EPA environmental, you know, pro-carbon, anti-carbon. There's almost nothing in the popular press or in the political dialogue that is kind of rational. And I think the reason is because, you know, our political mechanisms are very short-term. Energy is a very long-term thing. You know, a lot of it is measurable and quantifiable and modelable, but the way our system works is a kind of, especially in recent years, very polarized political debate. You know, even the facts are highly suspect as reported.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thanks for everything. We're about out of time. Before I open it up to the crowd for questions, are there any burning questions you'd like to ask of each other, or any issues you'd like to raise based on some of the comments that were made across the panel? I'll give you all the first opportunity to ask questions.
We had an hour and 15-minute pre-calls. I think we might have got those out of the way.
So I'd like to ask Clark, I'm just interested to get your feedback, if you can talk a little bit about some of the companies in your portfolio that have done really well and some that, you know, as recently as the last couple of months have unfortunately not done so well.
Sure. You know, I'd love to talk about my portfolio to large audiences anytime. You know, we have a few things that I think are interesting and disruptive technologies. Omni Water is doing oil field water recycling. We didn't talk about it. One of the huge changes happening in the whole energy landscape is in the conventional world with unconventional drilling, or in the oil and gas world with unconventional drilling. Unfortunately, something that people are realizing gradually is water is an important input in that, and so Omni's trying to help oil and gas operators recycle water in the oil field. Draker is monitoring arrays or photovoltaic sites, looking across sites at their performance on a relative basis, as well as the maintenance of those, and then drilling down into those where there are performance issues and understanding. Do I have an impairment? Do I have a bad inverter? Do I have do I need to send somebody to wash the array? Pretty simple stuff in some cases. That's high impact. You know, where things have failed, a lot of the times it's around misjudging financing risk, and it's around capital intensity. This is a feature of the landscape in most venture-backed deals. And in energy, it's particularly important. Somehow you're going to have to get to scale. Sometimes that takes a lot of money. Where does that money come from? Can you harness strategics? And you know, a lot of times companies think they've got it figured out, and it unravels.
I want to just touch on something that Clark mentioned, which we didn't talk about, is where the biggest revolution has happened in the energy sector, if you're looking at a purely BTU basis, is obviously oil and gas. And it's been the marriage of two technologies, hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, that are both decades old, right? And so we talked about this a little bit earlier about, you know, is it invention or are we looking at incremental changes? And so, you know, I think that that's a great example of technology that has revolutionized our energy landscape. And if you ask an oil and gas guy, he'll tell you, and by the way, we've reduced carbon more without any policy and with spurring the economy than any other industry, than any other sector. You know, and so it's the marriage of two fairly old technologies, using it in a new way, and seeing tremendous benefits from it. So again, kind of going back to that integration theme of what's currently out there.
Integration theme combined with $100 a barrel oil.
That's
helps.
right.
If it's $20 a barrel oil, we still wouldn't have fracking.
That's right.
True.
That's right. That's true.
Okay, well, thanks. We're going to start over here and just kind of go back and forth until time runs out on questions. I think they're trying to get us out of here and get back over for the keynote, so we're going to try to leave about 5 till, so we've got 5 or 6 minutes for questions.
Hi, good morning. I'm Tom Wortman with Concurrent Design, and I have a question. We are at the Energy Thought Summit, and through yesterday's events and today's events, I have not heard any discussion of what to me is the biggest challenge of our generation and certainly our children's generation of global climate change. The American Academy of Sciences just released a detailed report asking the question, where did science screw up and lose control of this discussion? The science is clear. Climate change is coming. Their concern is cataclysmic climate change. The oceans are on the borders of dying as the acidity pH levels increase dramatically, and this will happen in our lifetimes. So this is the Disruptive Technology panel. What disruptive technologies can we apply and make a boatload of money at in addressing the world global climate change question? Thank you.
I will start that question with a recent conversation I had with the Assistant Director for the National Renewable Energy Lab. And the President's goal is to reduce our carbon output by 80% by 2050. And most of that carbon output is from the electrical generation industry. So if you step that back a decade or so, it basically means we got to stop using carbon in electrical energy industry in about 2035. You step that back, you need to be able to prove that you can get to 100% renewable applications. At the megawatt scale, you can do a couple steps, but really within about 5 years. We haven't been able to demonstrate that, to do that cost effectively. So we have to do all the things. We need to decarbonize electricity, but we need to do this and save money at the same time. It's not going to happen because people, not just us, but people who are subsistence farmers in India aren't going to give up diesel generators just because they're worried about, what's going to happen to their children. They're trying to get by today. So we need to do all this stuff, but to do it cost effectively too, and it can be done. I think we're making progress. Unfortunately, that's not the driving factor. The driving factor is economics. We need to drive the economics faster. We need to drive it harder, and that's the way to solve the problem.
What, Tom, I don't think it's a technological issue at all. It's a human will issue. There's plenty of articles out there that'll argue that we're beyond the point of being able to rewind this, and there's a delay in the true impacts of climate change, right? And there's a 20 to 40 year delay in the intensity of those impacts, and so this is a human will issue. We've got technology that we can move beyond and lower emissions and even reverse some of those. We see revolutions happening all over the world. We don't feel any less free by climate change at this point, and we can argue the details of that, but I don't believe that it's a technological issue. I believe it's an issue of human will, and until our freedoms are restricted to the point where we're willing to march on our country's capitals, our state's capitals, nothing. I mean, we'll continue to make incremental change, and I hope that we make more than incremental change, but I would argue that it's a societal issue and not a technological issue.
And if I could pile on just slightly on that, if you saw like Badr Khan's keynote yesterday from Direct Energy, and caught that a lot of the products and services they're introducing and they're focusing on customer experience, they're seeing kind of across the board 18% savings in energy consumption at a residential level by focusing on that customer experience. So they're not focusing directly on climate change, but the outcome of what they are focusing on and getting to the societal and organizational will issues are resulting in a reduction in consumption, which then equates to reduction in CO2 produced. So there are different ways to come about this rather than, hey, we're going to have a technology that solves the issue. So, Jonathan?
Jonathan Clement, Clear Result. Based on connecting the dots, I think, from yesterday and today, there's a lot of discussion about the social or institutional barriers and inertia to technology adoption. Is the disruptive technology that we should be talking about in this panel one that focuses on social and institutional? Is there a technology that changes the way that regulators regulate, for example? So can you think of any social, institutional technologies that are what we're waiting for, as opposed to the development of disruptive technologies in water, energy, or the integration?
I'll take a shot at that one. I think there are things that enable consumers and businesses to make different choices that can happen very, very quickly. I think in the regulatory regime, there's sort of a constant tug of war there. And some things about the regulatory environment are the way they are, kind of purpose-built. It's not necessarily a bug or a feature. It's the way it has to be. And I think in some cases, the things that are the impediments are also the things that make sure that the buddy system is not funneling the public funds to somebody improperly, that processes are robust, that the safety of the public is looked after. And let's give the regulators some credit. They have a hard set of challenges that are their primary mandate. I think it's easier to be disruptive on as you guys are providing a value proposition to businesses. And in the case of like an O-Power disruptive, providing a value prop around consumer behavior. You know, I just think the regulatory thing is more, you gotta chip away at it kind of carefully.
And I guess I would argue that the connected home, the connected consumer are really social technologies, and being able to Tom's point about, you know, create that miles per gallon for the home or for the business so they understand their energy consumption. Those types of technologies are really almost leapfrogging the consumer's understanding of energy and just enabling it to be done for them. So you're starting to see energy delivered as a managed service rather than, you know, you're buying kilowatt hours.
If you think about iPhones, for example, or more generic term, smartphones, you know, I'm no longer tracking how much data I'm using or how much data I'm consuming. It's all about the experience right now. And so I don't know whether the benchmarks or the metrics are what's going to drive it ultimately, but I am, you know, interested in whether it is, if it's an institutional issue, because there's so much inertia behind capital and also our behavior. Consumers will get us a certain point, but I'm wondering whether at the city level, the regulatory level, if there is some kind of new technology, either a process, facilitation, interaction, whatever it is, that is necessary to create more room for some of these disruptive technologies to come in. Anyway, thank you for your thoughts.
30-second question. We deal with small and medium-sized businesses. We've talked about large things, CHP, storage, and we've talked about residential. What do you see coming down the line to help small business people who have very little time? It needs to be a set and forget, like a Nest. What do you see coming down the line for small business to be able to consume to conserve their energy and manage it? Anything?
Paul, I think
I'm very much targeting that market. One of the things that we think is really important in that space is reducing demand charges. So when you get your bill, you get both a demand charge and an energy charge. We've talked about energy efficiency forever, but there's also a demand and power efficiency game here too, which is equally important and may have even more benefits going back to the utilities because they have a rate base which is driven by peak power. Now, so what we're doing is we're working with customers who are installing energy storage systems in small and mid-sized commercial customer sites. Most of them are in California and New York State or New York City, but we think that's going to become a big market here in Texas next year. And we think it's very attractive. And we think very rapidly this is going to be a value proposition where it's going to be no money down. These guys are going to be able to install it in your place. It's going to be plug-in. You don't have to do anything in terms of changing your behavior. It will save you money from day one.
Thank you.
Another example would be big data analytics where you can benchmark what you're paying, what you're consuming against others, get useful information about what would help you in terms of conservation. Noesis here in town is doing stuff in that realm with maybe not small business, but sort of medium-sized enterprise people that are managing several buildings, so that the economics are there for them to want to invest the effort.
Last question.
An example of an entity that I believe disagrees on the need for the jet engine of the energy sector is, I think, China. They're spending a lot of money on new energy technology, including new types of nuclear. Do you think that the U.S. should be spending money there? And if so, should it be the private sector or should it be the government? Thanks.
I'll address that. The government is spending a lot of money. We talked about an Apollo program. There is, people don't recognize it, but there is some effort to do something like that. The Department of Energy has been pretty aggressive and particularly has started a new agency. It's the first major agency that's been developed in the federal government like 20 years. It's called RPE. It's modeled after DARPA, which has done a lot of breakthroughs in the defense area. We're honored to be an awardee of these projects. Most of these are relatively small investments in technologies that can be breakthroughs in these areas. So it's a little early to see, but some of those are starting to come out of the hopper, and I think we'll see good benefits from them.
So it's RPE?
RPE, yes.
RPE.
Yeah, it's a little, occasionally you get envious of China and their kind of, centralized command and control that seems to be working right now. Of course, there are a lot of downsides to that, and we tend to forget them, and then periodically, you have Tiananmen Square or something else to remind you. they have done a great job of building out infrastructure in a boom, super high growth economy. As things have slowed there, and as some of the excesses have ruptured in terms of like property bubbles, banking, overbuild of solar, you start to see the downsides of that, right? But for a while there, it looked like they could do no wrong. But I mean, part of what you have in China is, high-speed rails that nobody is riding on next to superhighways that are empty, going past, empty buildings that are built in giant, high-rise clusters. And so it's not all fun and games and working just like they say. And, some of that's not very transparent.
Well, Clark, John, Tom, Greg, Paul, appreciate you being here and the insights today. I think we'll hang around for a very few minutes right after John closes the panel before we head over to the keynote if anyone would like to talk to our panelists a little bit further. Okay. So thank you. Okay.